And can you tell me a little bit about how you think feminism, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but how it shapes research in psychology?
Yeah.
And for you in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, I felt a lot of tensions coming from a couple different directions within, because I feel like I always just grew up kind of split between psychology and women's studies or gender studies, from like always being involved in research and courses that were cross-listed and faculty mentors that were kind of spread between those two disciplines. And I think, so how feminism influences psychology, is that kind of?
In general and research, maybe in particular.
Research in particular, okay. So I think one really wonderful thing that a feminist perspective lends to psychological research is taking a more critical approach to research overall. So, for example, not just assuming that like social identity theory is going to apply to like every identity someone could have, right? So just always kind of keeping a critical eye toward that and recognizing how, you know, the systemic differences in power and perpetuation of oppression and things like that can influence like how people experience their social identity, and like how that might differ substantially from someone who has like a whole lot of status and power and things like that. So I think that psychology can really benefit from those perspectives, and research can reflect human experience more accurately and like with more breadth and depth than without those critical perspectives. So I think that's probably the major aspect. And then I also think methodologically there are some really big contributions that a feminist perspective can lend to research, and particularly with adopting mixed methods or qualitative methods, because for so much of the field of psychology there's such like a positivist lens, and there's such like a quantitative lens, and like behavioral experimentation and things like that, which is all great and fun and interesting, well, except for the positivism. But I think without people who are doing critical work, we wouldn't have this like infusion of mixed methodology and qualitative research, which is so important in getting to that like accurately reflecting human experience and being critical, as opposed to just like giving someone a survey that was developed with like a sample of 22-year-old white men from 1962. Not that all the rest of psychology is like that, but it feels that way sometimes.
Yeah.
when you're there.
Yeah.
And I still think there's a lot of tension between like methodological camps, right? That like quantitative people think qualitative research is completely subjective and worthless and just like someone's opinion that they decided to write down. And sometimes maybe from qualitative, I often feel when I'm in women's studies spaces, they're like, oh gross, quantitative work is like inherently unfeminist, which I don't, you know, that's my exaggeration, but I feel that sometimes, that tension. And then being in like psychology spaces, they're like, qualitative research, like that's just stupid. I'm just like, oh. So
can you talk a little bit about your experience of like living that tension and maybe not being totally at home in either?
Yeah. That is kind of how it feels, is I'm sort of like floating between the two sometimes. I think when I was in grad school, it was a little bit tougher because I think, one, the dynamics of the psych department that I was in were a bit more toxic, and so it might have not really have been about the methodology, but people were quick to like be harshly critical and not in a constructive way of one another, and oftentimes those camps like separated by like based on discipline. And so I think that what made that experience a lot easier is that I've just had like the world's greatest mentors throughout like my training periods, and that just eventually made it a non-issue essentially to like have the perspective of so my favorite methodology are using mixed methodologies, and so to have that be validated and to see like really, you know, world-class research being done with mixed methods, and seeing how quantitative methods can be approached with a more critical eye, in particular, has been probably the main way that like that tension has been soothed for me, or that I've been like totally confident in like bringing qualitative research into quantitative spaces and vice versa.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you had strong mentors as well during your master's and your PhD.
Yes, absolutely.
So you've always, I guess, been able to carve out like a feminist home within psychology. Can you tell me a little bit about your graduate experience?
Yeah. So I would say I had two primary mentors in grad school, and our program was continuing from master's to PhD, so it was all the same program, and so my official PhD supervisor is a woman named Elaine Hatfield, who is a social psychologist, and I mean, she came up in the field when things were super sexist. I think she got her PhD in, I want to say like 1963 or something like that, and so she was one of like the only female graduate students when she was a grad student. I believe she was the first female faculty member at her first faculty gig, and she would talk about how like she and her first graduate student at the time, who was also a woman, they didn't give her an office, first of all, so she just had to like squat in an office and just like take it over essentially. She talked about how she and her grad student would go to lunch and sit down at a table with a bunch of the other male faculty, and they would like one by one like leave and go sit at a different table and things like that.
Wow.
So yeah, I think like I'm sure those were like certainly formative experiences for her, and so I don't know, because of that or like through that, she was always immensely supportive of her students, and like creating a supportive and comfortable atmosphere for everyone, and the work that she did was like pioneering in her era, well, which is still going on, but was looking at passionate love, and so she's one of the first people to like consider love as something like measurable and something important to study and something that influences human behavior, and spent a lot of time like defending that and having to defend that. So I think she's pretty open to like thinking about ideas that are maybe a bit more critical or like understudied or less mainstream, and recognizing the value in that. And then my other primary person who served as a mentor for me, Susan Hippensteel, she was in the Women's Studies department, and she was just like a powerhouse, just like a really really interesting, really engaging person, with a really like strong, I don't know necessarily whether she identifies as a feminist, but she's like very much an activist within within her communities and within like giving representation. She served as the legal representative for gender equity on campus for a long time. She has a PhD in psychology as well as a JD, and so she's been just a very strong advocate for a long time, and she was a really strong advocate for me in particular, doing like bisexuality research and sexual minority research. So it was really great to have her around to be supportive in that environment.
Cool.